But I would just be, on dance floors till morning, or I'd be out in Goa at a rave for 2 days. And less said the better. But
I got a couple of questions. I spoke to the authorities, and actually I have a couple of photos here. Yeah, right. It's nice to have you here, man. I'm a big fan. Thanks for coming in. Tell us, I was hinting at it, tell us the 4 words you wrote down in Go in 2023.
I think I remember phrases. I said a different producer for every chapter.
Yeah.
I said a different location, blank slate, like just showing up and being open to the process for each one. And
I didn't mean to stress you out by trying to remind you.
What did I write 2 years ago?
According to the thing I got, you wrote three chapters, 3 geographies is the thing I got.
I did write that. 3 chapters, 3 geographies.
What does that mean?
I guess it was because I was sitting at that cafe in Goa, which was a place I hadn't been back to in 15 years. I've obviously been to India a lot in that time, but Goa was a place that meant a lot to me in my 20s, and I just hadn't gone back. And so sitting there in a cafe while my kids were still asleep in our little hut on New Year's morning, I felt really full of gratitude, and I felt really aware of what we receive from places, to be on that earth again and looking at that sea. It really fed me in a particular way. And I just felt really keenly aware of how these 3 continents that I've grown up in and have lived my life in have influenced me in different ways. And that's always been a theme in my work, but I wanted to lean into that a little bit.
India,
Europe,
UK,
the
Europe,
UK.
And America.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to blank slate. You said something about I wanted there to be a blank slate. And I find that, because I went looking for a lot of meaning in these 3.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about sort of what I was thinking while I was listening to it. But what I find really interesting about this is that you didn't go in with I'm going to make an album that starts here and goes there and goes there in 3. You went in blank slate. What does that mean?
Well, once chapter 1 happened, there was no more blank slate other than in a detailed musical way, because I started having themes emerge that I wanted to evolve and have continue into a conclusion by chapter 3.
Sure, yeah.
But starting, what I wanted was to create a situation where as a creative person, I was approaching something with a blank slate. I didn't want to be thinking too hard about how I wanted the music to be and coming at it from that intellectual, clever space. Because one of the things I find the most inspiring about being a musician are those moments of pure inspiration that happen, and those moments where you kind of make eye contact and click with another artist and something starts to flow that feels bigger than both of you. Those are the magic bits, and they can happen sometimes more easily on stage than they do in the studio. And I was trying to see how I could create that scenario for myself in the studio as well. So it wasn't like I was showing up with a list of songs I wanted to record. I'm here for that same experience of just allowing a flow to occur.
Did you have some sonic idea of what you wanted to do? Like, does that precognition around the music you want to make, does that, I mentioned in the beginning that you have made a lot of different kinds of records. Do you mean precognition that way, that hey, I'm going to make a record that it's sitar in this, and I'm going to make a record that's electronic in this, and this one was more, I'm just going to go in and see what happens?
That's a great question. I think, as you said, because boundaries have shifted so much in the last decades, when I was doing my earlier quote-unquote crossover records, sometimes those things were a bit more delineated, like my label would latch onto the idea that I wanted to work with flamenco, so we very clearly set me up a situation where I designed a whole album around Indian classical music and flamenco.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's kind of just making music, and it feels a lot more fluid. So I did have a sense of what I wanted to do, but it wasn't about genre. It was more about sound world and about the boundaries around my instrument. I feel with every increasing year, I chafe just that little bit more around what feels like a restrictive perception around my instrument, the sitar, because...
Help me understand that.
Well, I guess if you think of a guitar or you think of a piano, and I'm putting thoughts in your head, but you don't...
It's right there. It's easy
you
for me
don't
to
necessarily automatically think of a genre.
Nope.
You think of the instrument.
Yeah.
And it can be used to dig into any number of genres, and it can be a part of those. They're broken free of their classical roots or their rock roots or whatever they may be into being anything. Whereas with the sitar, you just hear that initial strum, and most people in the world, if they recognize that sound, have a very specific set of images and connotations that come with that, whether it's the 1960s incense, flying carpets, or if it's meditation
Ragas,
or raga.
Yeah.
And those things are a part of its history. They're a part of its journey. But the instrument is also broader and bigger than that and has so many other possibilities. And so when I'm designing an album now, I do think really carefully about who am I working with, who's engineering, who's producing, who can help me create sound from this instrument that's more high definition than it's been before, or how do we make it not so twangy as it may be on a classical record from the 60s? Or how do you make it sound completely different than it's ever sounded before? Just to help it kind of exist as itself in a broader way.
And you used Arouge Aftab on that first record, she came on the show not that long ago, and I just love her music so much. But for people who don't know, was this, kind of pioneered bedroom pop or bedroom music in Pakistan. Like, really was making music in her childhood bedroom when nobody was. Really has been making, sort of unclassifiable in a good way music. But what I'm hearing you say is you saw something in her.
Exactly. So she and I had a really beautiful full circle journey, because she's just a little bit younger than me. And so when she was at Berklee College of Music, she used to come to my shows. And I was kind of in my early crossover days back then. And we became friends, and we'd talk about my process and how I did stuff. And then all these years later, she'd come to a point where she was making music that I was finding really inspiring, because she's also found her own way of doing a similar thing, not the same, but in her own very distinct way.
Yeah, not making crossover music, but making really good music that incorporates a lot of different traditions within
it. And so I thought, you know what, in her last record in particular, I loved the sound world she created, and not just particularly in a production sense, but also in a musical sense of the space and the immensity that existed around her voice or around the instrumentation. And I thought working with her would help me do that, because that was something I wanted to do on Chapter 1.
Well, I think we've talked about it. I think we should listen to some of it. You got that? It's cool to be here with you. Like, that's such beautiful music.
Thank you.
It's really beautiful music.
Thank you so much.
That's Daydreaming, which is the opening track to the first one, Chapter 1, Forever for Now, based on a lullaby, I understand.
So this was the only kind of pre-existing song that wasn't an original new tune, even though I hadn't planned to use it until we got there. But a few months before that recording, I was sitting in the garden with my kids when one of them had been really sick, and we'd had a bit of a tough period of single parenting, 2 kids, different needs, trapped at home, one of those, And I was just trying to multitask all the things I needed to do by having the well kid on a trampoline, the sick kid on my lap, and my instrument, and trying to do the practice I needed to do for a show that was coming up. And because I had a sick kid on my lap, I was playing so differently than I would have in a normal practice session. And somehow my hands found this South Indian lullaby. I'm from the North Indian musical tradition, but I'm half South Indian in a heritage sense. And my hands found this South Indian lullaby that my mom and my grandmother used to sing. And my kid fell asleep on my lap while I was playing with it. And it just was a really beautiful moment in my life that I found myself wanting to come back to in the studio. It was something about transient moments, and how, even in times of difficulty or challenge, if we can be fully present, there can still be moments of beauty that can carry us through. Yeah. And that kind of became the kernel for the whole journey I wanted to trace.
Well, there's an opportunity there. You would see it as a restriction.
Yeah.
A kid on your lap.
Yes.
I can't practice. But there's an opportunity in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's go to Chapter 2 now.
Mm-hmm.
That is New Dawn from Anoushka's Grammy-nominated second album in her trilogy, Chapter 2, How Dark It Is Before Dawn. I got a bunch of questions about that.
Go on.
Is that multi-tracked sitar?
Yes. So layer upon layer upon layer of sitar, which, about 10 years ago when I did an album called Land of Gold, I started touring with a pedal board for the first time, and I started looping. And it's really changed. And it's another part of how I've changed the way I think with my instrument, because suddenly you can be a bit more orchestral or a bit more layered in the way that we play a linear melodic instrument. And it's influenced my writing since then a lot.
Right, because even though the instrument has, and I'm embarrassed to be trying to describe this in front of you, but even though the instrument has within itself, we can call it like self-accompanying things in the instrument. You are able to play sort of a harmonic background while you play a melody. This is very nerdy for the nerds, you still found ways to find more texture by looping.
Yeah, I mean, our again, coming back to the Indian classical music that the sitar comes from, it's a system based on melody and rhythm, or ragas and talas, not harmony and counterpoint like Western music. So our instruments aren't designed to play chords and those kind of broad textures in an accurate way. It's more lead melody stuff, even if we have resonating strings to make it sound fuller. So doing things like looping and layering, or even there's another song on, a couple songs on Chapter 2, How Dark It Is Before Dawn, where my incredible, film composing producer who thinks in a very different way, Peter Rayburn, found a way to completely turn, this is for the nerds, but to totally turn down the attack on the string so you don't hear my strumming, you just hear the resonance. And then we exaggerated that by 50 seconds. So suddenly I could be completely symphonic, where like one sound rings out for a minute and then I play another one and it layers. And I do that live with my pedal board, and I get to feel like I'm an immersive sound bath for people instead of a single linear instrument. It's totally changed how I play and think.
What's the emotion you feel? Because if you feel, not you feel constrained, but people would make you feel constrained by your instrument. What's the emotion when you hear all this texture and all these and you're able to say, look at what I can do when you hear that through the speakers?
I feel proud. I feel happy. I feel inspired. I sometimes feel a little bit nervous. Like there's always a part of my brain that's aware of, different demographics within my audience, which is part of my fortune, is that I have a broad audience. But that does mean that some people want one thing and some people want another, and some people are coming for a very specific thing and they're wading through those bits, kind of going, I don't get it, and then I'll play something a bit more classical and they're like, this is what I came for. And then of course other people are the opposite. So I have to stay focused on what I'm doing. But
how do you do that? Like, it's a bit of a personal question, but like, how do you? Listen, this is a show that goes out to a lot of, it's not the same thing, but this show goes out to a lot of the entire country. Yeah. And I am always thinking of like, this audience, the more traditional CBC audience, like, did I ask that question? But ultimately, I just want to do what I want to do.
Well, that's it. And I think it's less, it's not even in a selfish sense, right? It's like you want to do what you want to do. And by doing it, people will hear the authenticity in your question. You're not sitting there bored and rolling your eyes. Yeah. So they'll lean in. You might be, but... But it's the same for me. Like, I'm really aware, like, with making art, and not to sound too, like, highfalutin
Come on,
about
dude, look at this beard. You can do it.
Okay, well. But yeah, like it has to come from a real place. It's just not going to work otherwise, So it might reach a smaller number or whatever, but those people will hear the resonance or the truth in what I'm doing, and that's what they'll need out of it. So it has to be that.
I want to talk about. I chose New Dawn because I read it was inspired by some people in your life. The great American composer Philip Glass,
yes,
who, by the way, spends a lot of time on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. Oh, so
okay.
we'll call him half Canadian. The great violinist and conductor Yehudi Menuhin, and the Beatle George Harrison, and these people are all like family to you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Everything good?
Yeah, they are like family to me. I think I was thinking more specifically of Philip with some of the recording of this music, because I found, again, this is my nerdy brain, but I found it really interesting that not a lot of people know about those kind of Indian classical roots in the formations of minimalism and that part of 20th century classical music. And, obviously Philip Glass was really influenced by my father in his student days in Paris. When he was studying with Nadia Boulanger, he had a chance to notate music for my dad's soundtrack. And that really kind of opened his eyes to like melodic based music. And then he and my dad became friends, and that was really influential on the kind of music that he formed. And then obviously they became great friends. They made a record together called Passages that is one of my favorite records from when I was a kid. And so then growing up thinking the way that I've been thinking about music and wanting to kind of strip things down, it's almost like I think I'm being influenced in reverse by where the influence of Indian music got taken in the West. And then again thinking about those repeating mentalities and simplicities and not getting too linear and busy, and how to create that space for people through hypnosis and repetition. So it was almost like I was getting influenced back again in a full circle way.
Can I say it back to you to make sure I understand it?
Yeah.
So.
And one way of making me know I made no sense.
No, you made so much sense. I'm just a little dumb. It's that okay. It's that Philip Glass, of course, iconic, if we can use that term.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll say groundbreaking, innovative 20th century, 21st century composer. Composes a lot through in the lens of minimalism, and then meets your dad. Mm-hmm. He gets inspired to make melodic music by more melodic music by your dad. He gets inspired by Indian classical music, but by your dad, and then he brings that into his music and into a greater Western world. And so, by the way, so did the other people I mentioned. I think maybe that was my misunderstanding there. But all those three people were influenced by your dad and brought them into a greater Western, we'll say, consciousness. But what you're saying is that, interestingly, you are inspired by those people's interpretation of the music your dad taught them.
Yes.
That's kind of cool. That's kind of...
It is beautiful, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's just really interesting how these things kind of trickle and evolve. And, I've listened to such a broad array of music that, like, all of that influenced me too. Chapter 2, How Dark It Is Before Dawn. I think New Dawn's probably the only track that's more rhythmic, on the more rhythmic.
Oh yeah.
Chapter 1 was sort of medium mellow, and then I was thinking of it as that kind of afternoon in the garden with my kids, and then I was thinking from there that chapter 2 then would be nighttime, and it was about, okay, how do you heal in a bigger way? Sure, we have transient moments, but we need something bigger than that. I need a pause or a reset. The world needs a pause or a reset. So that was, the idea of how dark it is before dawn is like you take that night, you take that pause. So most of chapter 2 is very mellow, very immersive. And then I kind of gave myself New Dawn because I knew I wanted to end with the sunrise and go to chapter 3 that was going to be full rhythm.
Did you say heal?
Yeah.
From what? Do you mind?
Yeah, a lot of stuff. I think there's some stuff going on with someone I'm very close to that I won't share.
Sure,
but it's
fine,
like an ongoing, years-long kind of worrying for someone and being slightly helpless, and
I know that
that's difficult stuff, and it can be very draining. It can be very emptying, and so chapter 1 was coming for that place of like, how do I even make music or make an album when this is how I'm feeling? And then weirdly, it can also help because it's music and it's connection and it's. But then I just felt like I was thinking about the world, and it wasn't just me and lots of other people, or in a global sense, or politics. I just thought, wow, the world needs a pause. The world needs a little nighttime, like, reset.
And that leads us to chapter 3. We return to light, which is, and this is where we can talk a little bit about Goa and spending a little bit of time there in southwestern India, and the trance music and raves you found there in your 20s. Take us into one of those nights. What did they sound like? What did they feel like? I guess I discovered rave culture and more alternative culture in my teens, in the mid to late 90s. And then, by the time I had enough strict, parent freedom to be able to actually travel and go and do more of the stuff I wanted to do, I was a little bit older. So I was 18, 19 onwards. So throughout my 20s, I kind of felt like I lived a sort of double life, where on one side I was touring initially purely classically. I was touring with my dad as a teenager, and then I was touring on my own. And I was on all these classical stages, and I was playing ragas, and it was that very extreme on one side. And then I'd kind of get things out of my system by, in my private life, just having this completely other life where I'd be with friends and DJs and artists and kind of people my age. And would they have any interest or idea of who you were on that other side? Would they?
Some of them did. My friends would come to my shows. They wouldn't always get it. Some of them would want to know more, and some of them just sort of thought it was cool that I did that. But I would just be, on dance floors till morning, or I'd be out in Goa at a rave for 2 days. And less said the better. But
I got a couple of questions. I spoke to the authorities, and actually I have a couple of photos here. Yeah, right.
I am so glad for the time period that I was that age.
I know. I'm with
wow.
you. I had a good 18, 19, 20, 21 because of, I'm sorry, kids. You missed out.
It's true.
They did.
So that was kind of, I think that was in a way how I did the other. Like I could do one because I had the extreme other. And then, of course, in my music writing, they started to merge from my mid-20s when I started composing. All these other influences started coming up. And then I got sober in my late 20s, and then I hadn't gone back to Goa since then. And so this was sort of my first time going back with my kids in a different way. And I just really felt that sense of like where I was at now compared to where I was before. And it was just a beautiful feeling of homecoming.
Yeah, and that feeling of this was once a place which was quite, and I don't mean to laugh about it, but like debaucherous and free, but also like. Yeah,
because I think for a while I almost had to paint that with a negative lens in order to step away from it and just go, oh, that was just unhealthy, or this was just bad, or da-da-da. Yeah. But actually there's so much beauty to like that abandon and that joy and that collectivism that you find on a dance floor in your youth with people, and it's beautiful.
But that's not, so how does that lead to the sounds I hear on would it be better to play a track now and then we talk? Yeah, can we play a little something?
The mellowest, most acoustic one.
Hey, look at this beard. You know what I'm going to play. I'm not about, I don't look like someone who's about to pump his fist. I actually picked it because I wanted to talk about who else is on it, and it's such a beautiful piece. But outside of that being the chill piece, how did those feelings you were having about coming back to that place and post sobriety, which I didn't know, and channel into this record?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd made chapter 1 in Europe with Arouge, but we'd made it in Germany with Niels Fram, and it just felt like it dug into Europe a bit. I made chapter 2 in California by the Pacific Ocean. That really influenced the album. So I knew chapter 3 was kind of going to lean into my Indian side, and so I wanted to. I guess I had another quote-unquote intuitive thought that it could be a nice chance to work with someone I'd been friends with for a while and wanted to work with for a while, which is Alam Khan. He's an incredible composer and sarod player, and we have a lot of family history, even though we'd never ever played together before. But it felt like this sort of album was a chance for us to be able to meet and collaborate on our own terms. And yeah, he was up for it, and so we kind of penciled a week for him to come to London for us to work together. And then as the date was coming closer and closer, I thought, hang on, 2 string players. Like, this is different from my previous 2 chapters where I worked with a producer and a producer, and I just thought the 2 of us could just end up noodling all week. And so that's when I invited Sarathi Korwar, who I'd been touring with for the 2 years prior to that, and he, is an incredible percussionist and composer as well. And I just thought having that ear and lens would also really help us round things out.
So Sarathi was on the show, and Alam was on the show not that long ago.
Amazing.
So it's worth mentioning, just to give some context to people who don't have the lineage down. Alam Khan is the son of the sarod maestro Ali Akbar Khan, and your dads were buddies, I guess.
Our dads were more than buddies. Our dads were brother-in-laws for some decades when my dad was married to his first wife, who was Alam's aunt. And even more importantly than kind of family connections, my dad's guru is Alam's grandfather. So Alam's father's guru was his father, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so they shared a guru. So for 7-8 years of their young life, they lived in the same home, learning from the same guru, eating all the same meals, practicing together for 16 hours a day, And then they both went on to become 2 of the most legendary figures of 20th century Indian music, or all of Indian classical music. And so they have a long history and a very close history. And so in some ways, there's been a weight attached to the idea of Alam and I collaborating that I think when we were younger, we both shied away from.
Was there any talk of it when you were young?
Yeah, we would get a lot of offers, and we still would, from, say, a classical promoter that would think, let's recreate those legendary duets that their fathers used to do, and let's have them. But it feels like we're doing it for another gaze that doesn't really make sense. And it felt like, to do it in a safe space like this where we make whatever the music is that we want to make in our own way felt like a beautiful way to do it.
This might be too personal, but do you talk about it? Do you and Alam sit down and go like, yeah, man, it's an interesting thing? Because I was thinking about that. You said 2 of our fathers ended up becoming the most important.
Yeah.
That's what they have in common.
Yeah.
They became the most important, we'll say, like North American exponents, worldwide famous figures in Indian classical music. But what you have in common is that you both pursued those instruments.
Yes.
You on the sitar and Alam on the sarod. Yeah. You both pursued, and then you have both lived with, I guess, people like me or people doing press or, waiting for question 7 where they go.
We've waited this long,
waiting for
so
question
it doesn't
7,
look like we're asking that first.
Yeah, exactly. Do you guys talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, less now, but as a teenager, it was quite valuable to, Alam wasn't one of my closest friends. We didn't live in the same city. We both had our own lives, but it was quite unique to be able to talk about this particular aspect of our lives. What is it like having a father who is your guru, who is this kind of what's my word?
Stratospheric.
Thank you.
I got you. I got you.
Stratospherically huge figure to other people, and where you do want to play the music, but it comes with all this weight, and that's scary, but you don't want to run away from it because you love it. And, this whole hamster wheel of stuff that we would go through at that time, that when we would meet occasionally and speak occasionally, it would be really valuable.
Yeah,
and so we've grown up with that kind of, gratitude for that friendship, even if, again, we don't meet all the time or anything.
How is the feeling when you're sitting across from one another playing?
Weirdly beautiful.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Tell
it's
me.
weird. Again, all the stuff that I'm saying we want to shy away from, it's all right there.
What do you mean?
I mean that there's a truth to this stuff that's underneath the legend of it, if you know what I mean.
The legend being?
So there's like a story that sounds cool, like 2 legendary figures, their kids yay. You know, they're great story, right? Yeah, but there's a side of that that's just kind of fluff, and it's kind of building a story or building excitement. And then there's a part of it where it's like, oh no, okay, from the 1930s onwards, those two people were having their musical brains shaped by yet another genius musical figure. And they went on to find their own musical identities, but with a certain seed in the core of their musical identities, which they, in separate places, in different ways, passed on to their kids. Not because we're kids, but because we're their students.
Yeah. And their kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then to be able to sit in, in my early 40s in a room with a musician that I've never played with before, and have a certain kind of first language, not second language or third language, first language comfort in small nuances of how we did things. It is actually extraordinary, and it is a beautiful feeling, and it's all true on the inside.
I know what you mean. Like, there's the press release version of that.
Yeah.
That we would roll our eyes at, but then it actually is. Also, just because it makes sense, because there's a lineage passed on musically, because your fathers were, like not just your fathers. Yeah. It would make sense that there would be.
And I think just to broaden out for a second, I think context is important, because Indian classical music is not a written down form of music, right? And you know that, and not everyone knows that, but it's not the same as, say, Western classical music, where you can teach something around the world in conservatoires or colleges or whatever it may be, but like a Mozart piece is a Mozart piece, and how people interpret it is down to their artistry. But it is that piece. Every detail of how it's meant to be played has been suggested in the notation. For us, it's not like that. Like, I can't sit down with just anyone from any other musical family in India, because the way those ragas have been handed down for generations, the way inflections have been encouraged or discouraged, the way concepts have been leaned into or not, are completely different. So we don't have that. And that's why it's so extraordinary, where you really see the value of this, because we had something passed down a certain way.
I'm going to say this. It must be exciting for you. It must be like, because if there aren't that many people you can play with on that level, it must be nice to...
Yeah, it felt like meeting a close friend, It was beautiful.
And no wonder I love the tune so much.
Thank you.
This trilogy is really incredible. I assume it's a trilogy.
I'm done.
Okay. Actually, Tom, there's a
part 7.
Me and an auto harp next week. It's gonna be really good. Having finished them and explored all these themes musically, what has changed for you personally? Do you feel like there's been a shift inside of you, that you got something off your chest or out of your system through making these?
I think I've had a really quiet and beautiful sense of validation in what I really hoped for. The idea that blank slate approach could work. Just following an intuition. I'm going to call Aruj. We've never worked together before. We've been friends, but this is going to work. I'm going to stay 4 days early with my friend in LA who I've never worked with before, but our kids are friends and we love each other, and ask him to produce my second chapter, and that's going to work. And I'm going to call Alam, who I've never worked with before. And just leaning into that, like, whatever that hunch is a creative voice, and it says something that is truthful, and to find again and again across these 3 chapters that that's has really encouraged my confidence in listening to that voice, and in just being really simple about music making.
Is there a lesson there? Is there
yeah, for me there is. I don't know about anyone else, but for me, like, trusting and hearing that voice, which we can doubt so often, or we can kind of dress up with other things, but just really following that, and also to be simple. Like that simple, just as sitting and playing a melody intuitively or emotionally is the one. It's not the one where you've played it 10 more times to get the idea right. Or, that was really important for me.
I think these records are so beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's very cool to get the chance to talk to you about them.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for being here in Toronto, and thanks for coming in. And
it's been a pleasure.
Nice to do this in person. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.